Hi, this is Mr. Ramage, and this video lesson is going to cover the skills and methods standards for your Ohio State graduation test in American history. So there are 4 standards that we're going to cover in this video lesson, and these are going to help you understand how to read and write and analyze and critique your sources and information. The first standard is historical events provide opportunities to examine alternative courses of action. Now, this is an interesting standard because going through all the released questions, I was unable to find any questions that actually fit into the standard. So these are questions we haven't really seen before and will only appear on the test. So here are some things that we can look for and anticipate. In terms of this standard, this is basically the what if questions. So the standard says alternative courses of actions. So this would be things that could potentially have happened if things were different. So, for example, what if the US had not dropped atomic bombs on Japan? What if the US had not annexed the Hawaiian Islands? What if the US had joined the League of Nations at the end of World War I? And what if the South had won the Civil War? So, we're not exactly sure what we're going to see on the test until we see it, but in terms of what the language says in the standard, this is what I would kind of anticipate looking for. Some type of question that would pose an alternative course of action. What if things happened differently? What would have happened as a result of those changes? Again, I wish I could give you some more guidance on the standard, but going through all the released questions, I just didn't see any that fit this. The second standard is the use of primary and secondary sources of information includes an examination of the credibility of each source. Now, these for sure are on the release questions, and there are quite a few of them. So let's dive into the standard and try to better understand what we need to know and what we need to do. So a primary source, as you've heard a million times, is a document written during the time that the event took place that we're studying. So if we were studying the American Revolution, we might go to a letter written by Alexander Hamilton, or perhaps a newspaper article that was published during the American Revolution. These are just a few examples of what a primary source is. It was written by somebody who was there at the time of the event that we are studying or investigating or researching. And there are a lot of different things that would be considered as primary sources. Archives and manuscript materials, photographs, audio recordings, video recordings, and films, again, that were taken during the time. Journals, letters, and diaries, speeches, scrapbooks, published books, newspapers, and magazine clippings, again, published at the time of the event. Government publications, oral histories, records of organizations, autobiographies and memories, printed ephemera, which is a fancy word for things like tickets and posters and pamphlets and brochures and programs from like a play or a meeting that you went to, artifacts such as clothing, costumes, and furniture, and also research data. Public opinion polls would be a great example of that. So there are lots of different types of primary sources, but the main thing we need to know is that they have to be published and produced when the event took place. Now, a secondary source is written after the event by someone who was not present for it. So, for example, the book about Alexander Hamilton would be a secondary source written by a person in the modern time, and hopefully and probably going back to those primary sources to help them to write the book. So within a secondary source is typically primary source information. Textbooks are another tremendous example of a secondary source. They're written in the modern age, but they use primary source within them to help teach you or educate you on a certain event. So a good secondary source is written using primary sources, but within a secondary source, the author may insert their own opinions, their own interpretations of the events or topics that they're discussing, so it's not exactly what we might necessarily want to find. Primary sources are ultimately what we are looking for in doing historical research. Authors can leave details out, they could add things in, they can put their own spin on it, so there are things that you need to be wary of when reading a secondary source. Secondary sources should always cite their original sources in order to support the claims that they are making. So each book should list a bibliography or a list of resources that they used in order to gather their information and make their claims within their own work. So what are some questions to consider when examining a document or a source for that matter? Well, here are some questions from the Stanford History Education Group. They're the organization that produces the Reading Like a Historian activities that we've used in class. So some questions that you just might want to always ask yourself about an author or a document or a source that you're looking at are, who wrote this? What is the author's perspective? What's their point of view on this issue? Why was this document written in the first place? When was it written? Where was it written? And is it a reliable source? Why or why not? Is this a source that you would trust? So there's lots of different questions that you need to answer before making that decision if the reliability of the source is good or not. We also need to talk about bias. Bias is prejudice in favor of or against one thing, person, or group compared with another, usually in a way considered to be unfair. Okay? Another way to say that is bias is favoritism. In favor of something or against something. Identifying bias is very, very important when you're trying to determine if your source or your author is reliable or credible. If there was a paper titled, "Mr. Ramage is the greatest history teacher of all time," and the author was Jessica Ramage, my wife, there's probably some bias there. So being able to identify who's biased and why they're biased and what they're biased for or against is really important in helping you understand the credibility of your author. If the author's not credible, you probably shouldn't believe their information. The third standard is historians develop thesis and use evidence to support or refute positions. This is something that we've worked on this semester when doing our Common Lit activities. So what is a thesis? You guys know, you take English class every year you're in school. Thesis is a statement or theory that is put forward as a premise to be maintained or proved. And of course, whenever you're writing a thesis, you have to support it with evidence. So evidence must be used to either support or refute a thesis. To support a thesis obviously means that your evidence agrees with whatever your thesis is. When you refute something, that means you disagree with that thesis, that you can provide evidence to argue against it, that thesis is not accurate or true. In any good research, though, you should always explore both sides of an issue or topic. If you're only providing evidence to support a thesis or to disagree with it and refute it, then you're actually being biased. You have to find evidence for both sides of your argument. For example, if the thesis that we had was, by dropping the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the United States actually saved both American and Japanese lives. Well, we would need to go back to as many primary sources as we can to try to find evidence to support this thesis, that yes, dropping the bombs was a good thing in the long run because it saved lives. Someone else could also find evidence to refute this thesis and prove that our point is actually wrong. So evidence can be used to both support or refute a thesis. The fourth standard is an interesting one. It says, historians analyze cause, effect, sequence, and correlation in historical events, including multiple causation and long and short-term causal relations. Now, don't get overwhelmed by the language and the length of this standard. It's actually quite simple. So let's break it down and look at the different parts of this standard. First, we're talking about cause and effect, and that's pretty easy to understand, especially when you're studying history. An event happens as the result of a specific event or action. If I do X, then Y happens. For example, when talking about World War II, the United States dropped 2 atomic bombs on Japan. That would be a cause of the end of the war. So the effect of those bombs would be that Japan surrendered and World War II is going to come to an end. It's a cause and effect relationship. Because we dropped the bombs, Japan therefore surrendered. Sequencing is placing events in order. So in terms of historical events, let's look at World War I. Bosnia was annexed by Austria-Hungary. That led to the terrorist group, the Black Hand, being formed in Serbia. That led a young teenager by the name of Gavrilo Princip to join the Black Hand to be trained as an assassin. That led to the Archduke visiting Sarajevo and trying to make nice with the people of Bosnia, which led to his assassination, which led to World War I. So in sequencing, we're putting events in order. We're looking to see how things played out and making sure we understand the correct order in which they played out. Correlation means that a statistical relationship exists between two things. They might either increase or decrease together. So for an example, when we looked at the stock market in the 1920s, as the stock market went up, so did inflation. Money became less valuable and prices continued to rise. So as the market rose and business increased significantly in America and overproduction took place, inflation rose with it. So in a correlation, things move together. They either increase together or they decrease together. So in a correlation, events tend to move together. And the last part of that standard talks about multiple causation and long and short-term causal relations. And this is a little bit easier to understand. So in terms of causality or causation, an event in history may have many causes. There's typically not one thing that causes an event to take place. And for some events, those things might take place over a short period of time, that are days or weeks perhaps, while other events are triggered over a long term. So there's multiple events happening over a very long period of time. Like, for example, with World War I, if we look back, we can see that there were a number of different causes that brought us to the start of World War I. Nationalism, alliances, imperialism, and militism, for example, all of that developed over the course of a couple of decades, leading us to World War I. So in terms of looking at history, there are multiple causalities, multiple reasons for events to happen and take place, and sometimes those take place over the short term, while sometimes it takes a lot longer for things to play out. So let's quickly review these 4 standards for our skills and methods. Number 1, historical events provide opportunities to examine alternative courses of action. This means that if you study history, it's sometimes kind of fun to ask what if. The second standard is the use of primary and secondary sources of information includes an examination of the credibility of each source. This is definitely something that you're going to see on your real test. You're going to have to explain and describe what a primary or secondary source is, but more importantly, you're going to have to identify what makes a source credible or not credible. The third standard is historians develop thesis and use evidence to support or refute positions. This is something that you're also going to have to do and will definitely be on the real test. You're going to have to look at some evidence and determine if that evidence supports or refutes the thesis that you're provided, and you're going to have to do that probably 2 or 3 times. And the last standard is historians analyze cause-effect, sequence, and correlation in historical events, including multiple causation and long and short-term causal relations. For this question, it's more than likely you're going to see something with sequencing or for cause and effect. I haven't seen too many release questions that deal with this standard, but I have seen a few sequencing ones that you're going to take a look at as well. So, hopefully this video lesson gets you up to speed on the skills and methods questions.